There's a type of investigative reporting that we like to do that I call creating new realities. And that is, you become so immersed in the topic, you become the expert on the information, you get to a point where you know more about the subject matter than actually the people who are involved in it. In this case, we ended up knowing more about police practices than the police department. We knew more about how the prosecutor's office had done things than the current district attorney and his associates. Now granted, they're a relatively new administration, but I would bet that we probably would have known more than even the previous administration, because we took the time, we studied the records, we connected the dots, we asked the questions.
Because it works. You have a victim up there who says, that's the man who raped me, I'll never forget him. And, jurors are going to believe it because we want to believe what we see is what happened. And it doesn't mean that the witness is lying. The witness, if the person is wrong, they're mistaken. And it doesn't mean that all eyewitness testimony is wrong. I think that the people who want reforms, they don't want to do away with eyewitness testimony. They just want to make it better.
As long as they can do this and prosecutors say, looks good to me, judges say the same, and juries say, well, okay, if the victim says that's him, we're going to go with the victim. As long as that process remains pretty much the way it has been, there's not sufficient impetus for them to change. It's not that they think they're doing anything wrong and they don't care. It's that this has always worked. There have not been questions raised to a great extent up until fairly recently, and even as the questions have been raised, if all you have, and this is typical of most jurisdictions I think, if all you have is one wrongful conviction out of 10,000, then you can write it off to, well, this one, had a problem, but that doesn't mean they all have problems. So you can write it off to kind of an episodic thing as opposed to something that happens routinely. And I think that's happened a lot. Even in some of the bigger jurisdictions, they'll say things like, well, we try 10,000 murder cases a year, and we've only had a problem with one going back 25 years, so I don't think we need to jump the whole system and re-examine the whole system just because of that. What they don't look at is that the same factors that came into play in this wrongful conviction are a factor in a lot of your cases, maybe most of your cases. And just because those cases haven't come back as wrongful because there wasn't DNA or there wasn't other evidence that was presented to you, doesn't mean that you don't have a larger problem than just this one case. So they've done this because it works. They've done this because they haven't had sufficient pressure brought to bear on them to change. And they think they're doing it, they think they're doing the right thing. I mean, I don't think this is largely a situation of corruption amongst law enforcement. I think it's more along the lines of this is the way they've always done it. Well, a show-up identification is something that's been used by law enforcement in this country for hundreds of years. It's nothing more complicated than someone becomes a victim of a crime. Usually it's a street kind of crime, an assault of some kind, or a robbery is another common form, and they will make an outcry to someone on the street, a police officer, and say something along the lines of, I've just been robbed or just been mugged, and the guy who did this just ran off in that direction, and the police officer will then try to apprehend that individual who's been described to him, sometimes in pretty generic terms, as close to the scene as is possible. So show-ups tend to occur on the street shortly after a crime has taken place and based on a very scant description of who the offender may have been. The police officer will then typically, if they can find someone, will take them back to the scene where the crime took place or take them back to where the witness is and then ask the witness, is this the person who committed this crime against you? So how they differ from other kinds of identifications is it's just one person. It's also referred to sometimes as a one-person lineup. So it's your choice if you're the victim is either it's this person or it's not.
we were very successful in terms of impact, and obviously when you spend this much time and effort and money on an investigation like this, you want to have impact. Before we could even publish our findings, some of the police departments changed their procedures. They knew what our findings were, obviously, before we published, because we had to go to them and ask them for reaction. So we started having an impact as a result of our work even before we put the stories in the paper. And then after the stories published, there were other changes in procedures at the police level and the district attorney level, and there was a call by a state legislator to change the way certain things are done statewide.
Well, we had some pretty immediate response from the Dallas Police Department, which we had talked to them, of course, as a part of the reporting, so they knew what we were working on, and they had actually made at least one change that we know of prior to those stories being published. They decided that after we'd raised questions about show-ups, that they would issue a policy that banned their officers from using what are called single photo show-ups. It wasn't a live show-up. They would just show a crime victim a picture of one person and say, is this the person? And they quit doing that. They issued a policy statement probably within the month before we published, saying we shouldn't be doing this anymore. So we actually had some reaction before we even published. Also, the district attorney, knowing what we were doing, decided that because of some of the concerns we'd been raising about eyewitness identification and the processes that were being used, that he would review death penalty cases to determine whether or not there might have been some problems in death penalty cases that had been prosecuted earlier, to see whether witnesses had made improper judgments or whether there had been any impropriety on the part of prosecutors in putting those cases together. Then once the series was published, the police department immediately decided that they would launch a review of show-ups to see how often show-ups were actually being conducted. They'd never looked at this. I mean, they never kept stats on this. They just assumed that they didn't happen very often. So it's really kind of a two-step process of first getting a listing of the cases, and that can be done sometimes through open records, sometimes it has to be done through whatever the computer services, the information technology section of the county or the local jurisdiction is. And then secondly, once you get that list, to go where the trial transcripts are, where you can actually read the list of what evidence was presented at the trial. And this can be done anywhere. I mean, it's not unique to Dallas. So anybody can do that kind of thing, and if you don't necessarily have to do it with armed robberies. It depends on what you're looking for. Eyewitness identification was what we were looking for. So what we did was we first determined what's the quintessential eyewitness ID case. Almost everybody said robberies, so we made a list of robbery cases. That's how it worked here.
I think a good story would be that the fact that most police departments don't have policies. There are very few that actually do. So that in and of itself would be a story. Or if they have a policy, it's not a very lengthy one and it's maybe not really followed. And the same is probably true for prosecutors, that they don't really receive any training about, when a police officer brings a lineup to you, prosecutors aren't trained to say, how did that guy end up in the photo lineup? Or, how did this guy come to your attention, and questions like that. And there's really not a lot of training that goes on like that. And I think that both the Innocence Project or the Justice Project would really be able to, help a reporter, get into those type of stories. And I think a lot of times we do that first day story of this person was wrongly convicted, and it's horrible, and this person spent 20 or sometimes 30 years in prison, but it could happen again unless we look at why it happened.
Well, I don't think there's any more basic than getting the right person, and that's what this is really about. Is about a system that has over countless numbers of decades, maybe since the criminal justice system in this country came into being, has been, even though it says it's committed to convicting only the guilty, that we actually have a long history of convicting the innocent in this country. And as appalled as people will say they are by that, what do they do to keep it from happening again? So I don't think there's anything more basic in criminal justice or in reporting on the criminal justice system than to look at cases of wrongful conviction or potential wrongful conviction. And journalists have been doing this for untold years. Our challenge is how do we look at these things in creative ways? How do you keep that level of outrage alive? Because people should be outraged by this. I mean, these people are being convicted in Dallas. You're convicted in the name of the state of Texas. If you're in another state, it is always the people versus so-and-so. So this is not, this is not something that doesn't affect everybody. It not only is it in your name that these people are being convicted, it could happen to you and to your family and to people you care about. Because if the system is that geared towards conviction that it doesn't take proper notice of things that raise questions about the guilt of someone, then it really can happen to anybody. And that should be of concern to everybody who cares about whether the system of justice works properly in this country. Too long, it's too easy to write off that this only happens to people who deserve it.